They tell you that memory fades with age, that the mind softens the sharp edges of the past like a river stone worn smooth by the current. That is a lie. The years have taken my knees and the steadiness of my hands, but the smell is as fresh as if I were still sitting there, encased in 20 tons of Krupp steel. It was a cocktail of heated oil, unwashed bodies, stale rye bread, and the acrid, metallic tang of fear. We called it Panzerfunk tank funk, but it was more than an odor. It was an atmosphere, a heavy, suffocating blanket that coated the back of your throat and clung to your skin long after the engine died. I was 27 then, old for a tank crewman. Ancient by the standards of the boys they were sending to the front by 43. I sat in the loader's seat of the Panzer IV, my knees pulled up to my chest, staring at a bolt on the turret ring that had rusted into the shape of a skull. Or maybe it was just a bolt, and my mind was already playing tricks on me. The heat was the first thing you noticed, a dry, baking heat that turned the interior into a kiln, but it was the vibration that drove you mad. Even at idle, the Maybach engine didn't just hum. It shuddered, sending a low-frequency tremor through the soles of your boots, up your spine, and into the base of your skull, rattling your teeth until you felt like a loose assembly of parts waiting to fly apart. It was a long way from Garmisch. Sometimes, when the waiting became too much, when the air inside the hull grew so thick I felt I was breathing water, I would close my eyes and force myself back to the mountains. I would summon the silence. Not the heavy, pregnant silence of the front line before a barrage, but the crisp, living silence of the Bavarian Alps in deep winter. In my mind, I was not Klaus Richter, Unteroffizier of the 7th Panzer Division. I was Klaus the Trapper, kneeling in snow so deep it swallowed sound. I could feel the bite of the wind on my cheeks, smelling nothing but pine resin and the clean, sharp scent of impending snow. I remembered tracking a stag for 3 days across the ridge lines, moving so slowly that the birds forgot I was there. I remembered the patience, the absolute control. In the forest, if you made a mistake, you went home empty-handed. Here, if you made a mistake, you burned. A drop of hydraulic fluid landed on my neck, hot and slick. I didn't wipe it away. It was coming from a hairline fracture in the recoil guard, a slow, rhythmic leak that I had reported 3 times to the maintenance battalion. They had no parts. They never had parts. I flinched. That sound was louder to me than the artillery rumbling in the distance to the north. It was the sound of the machine failing. That was my nightmare. It wasn't the Russians, or their anti-tank rifles, or the Sturmovik screaming down from the clouds. It was the tank itself. I had a terror irrational and consuming of the engine seizing, the tracks snapping, the hatch jamming shut. I felt like Jonah in the belly of a whale made of iron, but this whale was sick, coughing and sputtering, ready to die and take me down with it into the crushing depths of the earth. I was a man of the open air, a hunter who needed the sky above him, and I had volunteered to be buried alive in a moving coffin. Richter stopped twitching, the gunner muttered, not looking away from his periscope. His voice was tinny, distorted by the throat microphone and the static in my headset. I'm not twitching, I lied. My hand was trembling against the breech of the 75 gun. I wanted to open the hatch. I wanted to climb out, strip off the gray tunic, and walk south until I saw the Alps again. I wanted to refuse this. The urge to flee was a physical pain, a cramp in my gut that doubled me over. I looked at the floor of the fighting compartment, covered in spent shell casings and grease. This was not a place for human beings. It was a factory of death, and we were just the soft, pink gears turning the mechanism. The fluid hit my collar this time. I closed my eyes again, desperate for the snow, but the image wouldn't hold. The white slopes of Garmisch were bleeding into the gray steppes of Russia. The pine trees were turning into billows of black smoke. It stung. Panzer Marsch, the command crackled through the intercom, shattering my internal retreat. The driver slammed the transmission into gear, and the tank lurched forward with a violence that threw me against the ammunition rack. The engine roared, a deafening crescendo that drowned out my thoughts, the drip, the fear, everything but the immediate reality of motion. We were moving. The waiting was over. We rolled forward, part of a steel river flowing toward the horizon. The dust inside the compartment kicked up, choking us, coating our sweaty faces in a fine gray powder. I could feel the tracks chewing up the earth beneath us, a grinding vibration that resonated in my chest. We were heading up a long, gentle rise, the ground trembling under the weight of hundreds of tanks. Cresting, the commander barked. As we broke over the ridge, the world opened up. Through the narrow vision slit, I saw it. The valley below wasn't land anymore. It was a seascape of fire and dust. The horizon was erased by a wall of smoke that stretched from the earth to the heavens, black and roiling. And emerging from that smoke, like beetles swarming a carcass, were the T-34s. Hundreds of them, a plague of iron crawling across the sunflower fields. The sheer scale of it punched the breath out of me. It was the end of the world, orchestrated in steel and fire, and we were driving straight into its maw. The descent into the valley was not a march. It was a fall. The disciplined geometric formations of the training manuals disintegrated the moment we hit the uneven ground of the Balka. The 7th Panzer Division, the Ghost Division, became a scattered pack of wolves running through tall grass, hunting and being hunted. The air inside the turret changed. The stale heat of boredom vanished, replaced by the electric, ozone-charged atmosphere of active combat. I stopped being a soldier then. The uniform, the rank, the orders, they peeled away. I became what I had been before the war, a hunter. My eyes were useless in the loader's pit, restricted to the narrow view of the breech and the ammo racks, so I hunted with my ears. The cacophony of battle was a wall of noise to the untrained ear, the roar of engines, the thumping of artillery, the scream of tracks. But to me, it was a forest, and in a forest you survive by isolating the sounds that don't belong. I closed my eyes, pressing my helmet phone tight against my ears. I filtered out the roar of our own Maybach engine. I pushed aside the chatter of the commander, coordinating with the platoon leader. I listened for the anomalies. "Richter, load HE," the commander shouted. I grabbed a high-explosive shell, the weight familiar and comforting, and slammed it into the breech. My hands moved with a muscle memory that bypassed my brain. "Up," I yelled, tapping the gunner's shoulder. The gun fired. The recoil was a sledgehammer blow to the air pressure in the turret, a sudden vacuum that popped my ears. The breech block slammed back, ejecting the smoking casing, which clattered to the floor. The smell of cordite flooded the compartment, sharp and biting like ammonia. We were moving through a field of sunflowers, the stalks 6 feet high, whipping against the hull like 1,000 dry fingers. To the others, the sunflowers were just concealment, a visual barrier. To me, they were a warning system. Through the vision block, I watched the sea of yellow heads bobbing in the wind. But something was wrong. To our right, about 300 meters out, the rhythm of the swaying stalks was off. The wind was blowing east to west, but a patch of flowers was shivering against the grain, twitching as if disturbed by something heavy moving low to the ground. "Movement right." 3 o'clock, I shouted into the intercom, my voice cracking. "I see nothing, Richter," the gunner snapped, traversing the turret left, chasing a T-34 that was cresting a distant hill. "Eyes front. Trust me," I yelled, abandoning protocol. 3 o'clock, deep in the flowers. The commander hesitated. In that second of hesitation, I saw it, not the tank, but the reaction of the natural world to it. A flock of larks erupted from the field, not flying up, but scattering low and frantic. Birds don't fly like that for wind. They fly like that for predators. "Hard right. Driver, hard right," the commander screamed, his voice pitching up an octave. The driver didn't ask questions. He hauled on the right steering lever, locking the track. The Panzer IV skewed violently, the rear end sliding out. Tracks tearing up the black earth. The entire chassis groaned under the torque. The air outside the tank split open. A high-velocity round from a hidden anti-tank gun screamed past our hull, occupying the space where our engine block had been a fraction of a second before. The shockwave slapped the side of the tank like a giant hand, ringing the armor like a bell. "Target identified," the gunner roared, finally seeing the muzzle flash in the sunflowers. Firing, our gun barked. The shell arc was flat and true, 300 meters away. The sunflower patch erupted in a geyser of dirt and metal parts. The crew was silent for a heartbeat. The gunner turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the whites of his eyes through the grime. He didn't say anything, but the look was there. The realization that we were blind, and I was the only one who could see in the dark. But the relief was short-lived. The battlefield at Kursk was not a place of individual duels. It was a grinder. We had survived the sniper, but we had exposed our flank. The sensory shift was instantaneous. The low rumble of the advance was gone, replaced by a high-frequency terror. Shrapnel rained against the hull like hail on a tin roof. The air outside was screaming. Mortars, rockets, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, they all had different voices. A choir of industrial violence. I reached for another shell, my hands slippery with sweat and oil. I was checking the primer when the world ended. There was no sound at first, just a massive, concussive impact that felt like the tank had been dropped from a cliff. The universe turned white, a blinding magnesium flare that burned through my eyelids. I was thrown across the compartment, my shoulder slamming into the radio equipment with a bone-crunching thud. Then the darkness rushed back in, absolute and suffocating. The engine died. The roar of the battle outside was suddenly muffled, distant. Inside, there was a terrifying silence, broken only by the hiss of escaping pressure and the groans of the crew. Then came the smell. Not cordite, not sweat, the sharp, stinging stench of burning rubber and melting copper wiring. Report, the commander's voice was a ragged whisper in the dark. No one answered. I tried to move, but my legs were tangled in the debris of the ammo rack. The floor was tilting. We were hit. We were dead in the water, and the smell of fire was getting stronger. Report, the commander's voice was a ragged whisper. No one answered. We were drowning, not in water, but in silence. The engine was dead. The ventilation fans had stopped. The air inside the hull began to stagnate, thick with the stench of ozone and fear. We were blind, crippled, and deep in the enemy's throat. The battle had rolled past us, leaving our steel carcass stranded in a sunflower field that was rapidly becoming a graveyard. Hours bled away. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the interior into absolute darkness. The cooling metal of the tank began to contract. It ticked. Every few minutes, a sharp metallic crack echoed through the compartment, sounding like a pistol shot in the confined space. We froze every time, waiting for the hatch to open, waiting for the grenade to drop in. This was the drowning I had feared. The steel monster was no longer my armor. It was my coffin. I had to escape, not with my body, but with my mind. I closed my eyes. I pushed away the smell of burning rubber and unwashed men. I forced myself to forget I was a soldier in a Panzer IV. I went back to the Bavarian forests. I became the hunter. I opened my ears. I let the darkness amplify the world outside. The wind rustled the dry stalks of the crop. A nightjar called out, distant and lonely. Then a new sound cut through the natural rhythm. It was rhythmic but irregular. The soft crush of a boot on dry soil. The faint slide of fabric against metal. My eyes snapped open in the dark. I could not see my crew, but I could smell their terror. The enemy was here. Not an army, but a killer team. Stalking us. They were moving into our blind spot. The rear quarter where the armor was thinnest. I visualized the terrain outside. A small drainage ditch ran 10 meters to our right. That is where I would be. I reached out and gripped the gunner's shoulder. His muscles were rigid, vibrating with the tremors of adrenaline. I squeezed once. Hard. He froze. He understood. I leaned close to his ear, my breath barely stirring the stale air. 3 o'clock. Depression maximum. High explosive. I felt him shift. The manual traverse wheel groaned as he cranked it. The sound was agonizingly loud, a rusty scream in the silence. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The stalking predator had heard the prey move. The game was up. I squeezed the gunner's shoulder again. Fired. He pulled the release. The main gun did not just fire. It detonated the world inside our box. The recoil slammed the tank sideways, throwing us against the bulkheads. The muzzle flash lit up the interior for a fraction of a second, burning the image of my crew's wide, white eyes into my retina. Then, the universe collapsed into a high-pitched ringing. We were deaf, we were dazed, but we were alive. The shell had obliterated the ditch and everything in it. But the flash had been a lighthouse beam in the dark ocean of the steppe. We had killed the immediate threat, but we had just announced our exact location to the entire Red Army. We could not stay. The tank was dead. If we remained, we would join it. We cracked the hatches. The night air rushed in, cold and tasting of wet earth. It tasted like life. We scrambled out, sliding down the glacis plate, hitting the dirt with our weapons clutched to our chests. I looked at the dark shape of the tank against the stars. It looked pathetic now, a broken toy. I turned my back on it. I took the lead. The commander was shaken, his maps useless in the dark. But I did not need maps. I needed the wind and the stars. I became the pack leader. We moved through the gullies and the ravines. I smelled the Russian harsh tobacco smoke 100 meters before we saw their sentries. I heard the click of a bolt carrier in the brush and froze, my men with a hand signal before the shot could be fired. We were no longer conquerors driving steel chariots. We were wolves moving through a sheepfold, silent and lethal. We walked for 3 nights. We drank from muddy ruts. We ate raw sunflowers. When we finally stumbled into the German picket lines, we were not cheering. We were hollow. The transition is instant now. The Russian mud vanishes. I am an old man sitting in a velvet chair in Garmisch. The view of the Alps is pristine, but the silence is the same. The central heating unit in the corner clicks on. It is a dull, metallic sound. My hand resting on the armrest spasms. The coffee cup rattles against the saucer. My hearth hammers against my ribs. It is the sound of the cooling tank. It is the sound of the coffin closing. I look at my hand. It is spotted with age, but it still shakes with the vibration of an engine that died 70 years ago. I was a hunter before the war. I made my living from the land. I thought I understood the laws of nature. Kill or be killed. But what we did in the East was not nature. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. I never went back to the woods. I sold my rifles. I cannot look down a scope without seeing the faces of men who were just trying to defend their homes. I cannot sit in a tree stand and wait for a deer, because I know what it feels like to be the animal waiting for the bullet. The hunter died in that steel box. Only the prey survived. The machine is broken forever. The harvest is ruined. I am left with the silence and the faces of the men I led through the dark. Forget the maps and the flags. Remember the faces. That is the only story that matters. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.